Hi there, I'm Rachel Winter. I'm in the History 1100 class, and today I will be answering the question given to us for this argumentative paper on how did the need for a steady supply of water affect the technological, economic, political, and legal development of ancient societies. And for this, I just wanted to start by saying how important water is. Water, whenever we don't have enough, can dehydrate us and lead to death. When we have too much of it, however, we can find that we are hypertensioned and that our cells explode, and it makes us feeling even worse. And it's a lot harder to combat that. So, I have my water ready for me. We're going to start by talking about water sources. Our water sources, such as oceans and lakes, are great in finding large masses of water, but rivers are where it really starts. Rivers, being that they are a steady supply of fresh water, were then also a source of power for the developmental aspects of ancient civilization. This is evidenced by an influence of the river upon image and depictions of political leaders, as well as the use of technology and irrigational layouts that show the similarities of then, in the past, to our present times. Additionally, back then, the legal parameters set in place in the time that they were truly reflected the care the leaders felt was needed for water. For our first argument, we're going to be looking at political leaders. Political leaders would not allow themselves to be depicted in a common fashion or show others holding influence over them. However, in our first source that we're going to be looking at, which is source number 3 from our chapter, we get an early Egyptian king cutting an irrigational ditch drawn from a mace head carving. If we're looking at this together, you can see that you have the depiction of the king in the center with 2 people fanning him behind and a person holding out what we can only assume to be another fan in front of him, making sure that he is comfortable while doing the same work as common folk would normally be found. This is a very useful description in saying that our leaders of this time saw that water was such a prominent thing to give them power as well as to empower their citizens and their bodies. This showing that the water held a great deal of power and that they found it just as important to do themselves and to oversee themselves as they would to delegate onto a common folk, such as an engineer or whatever you have. Next, we're going to be looking at our source number 9, which is Sima Qian's description of the building of the Zhangjiao Canal. And I didn't want to look at this whole source only because the important part of it that I want to use to talk about is the fact that we have the hydraulic engineer Cheng Qiao being enlisted by Prince of Han, in the state of Chinchín, and how eager he was to get profits from building these canals and these rivers at the foot of the mountains, that he enlisted this hydraulic engineer to go talk to the king and to convince the king of this land that building these canals was going to be so beneficial to everyone when he was secretly looking to just reap the profits for himself. Now, in enlisting a hydraulic engineer rather than going to talk to the king himself, he is showing that this hydraulic engineer has a level of power that he does not possess. Whether that power be from the knowledge that he holds or just from the fact that water is such an important aspect of this time and how much you are needing it in order to gain power and wealth, the hydraulic engineer is holding a level of power that allows him to go and talk to the king about a project of this scale. And finally, for this first argument, I'm going to be looking at source number 13, which is our memorial from Zhang. The reason I wanted to look at this is that you have a flood control specialist, someone who, in our day and age, you would think, yeah, that's a normal, maybe middle-class job. Something that's like not super important, something that we all just kind of have. But in this case, he's making an imperial decree, something that would be seen from a higher person of a higher power, showing that people who were water technicians, water engineers, a flood specialist, these were very high-class positions, and that the technological influence that they had was so great that they were able to make things such as an imperial decree or go talk to a king, as we saw in our last evidence source. And Jean Reng brings up a beautiful description as to why digging canals is such an important thing. And he says that digging canals has 3 benefits as well as 3 detriments if you do not make them. The 3 benefits to having canals is that they provide transportation, they increase fertility, and that productivity is increased 5-fold, as he says in the source. The productivity increasing means you're able to feed a greater amount of people. Being able to have that transportation and being able to have that trade increases wealth in your society. And then the 3 detriments he speaks of is that when you have a river overflow into your area, the moisture in the air can make people ill. And we've seen this in our own experiences in our lives with floods happening in many countries, and we see how much it affects them, how much it damages their areas, how people get so terribly sick from this. And that's another thing that he says. He says that destruction happens anytime there's a flood. He, specifically to quote him, he says that when the river breaks, the dikes and overflows, destruction ensues. So he's saying that destruction of buildings, of your farms, of anything that's around it, all happen. He says that people become the victims, he says, they become the food for fish and turtles. Things that we normally eat are going to be eating us if we let these floods happen. He also says that trees will rapidly rot away and the soil will turn to alkaline, and that does not produce grain. He's saying that if we don't do this, that we are going to be ruining the consequences of this whole detriment. Now, moving on to my second argument, we're going to be saying how the technology that they had back then reflects technology we have today, and how the technology we have today can help us see how similar the water patterns are and the irrigational patterns of back then were. To start with this, to show a very obvious depiction, we're going to be looking at sources 4 through 7, which show different technological sketches of technological pieces that they had back then. The one that catches my attention almost immediately when I see it is the Noria. The Noria looks greatly like a water wheel, which we had water wheel houses all throughout the country, and we still have some today. Up in northern Minnesota, where a lot of my family lives, I know I've gone up there as a child and I've seen 1 or 2 in my day. And in the spring and the summer, they're beautiful. They just rotate around and they create this gorgeous effect. But they're actually very useful for creating electricity nowadays. And back then, they were able to flow the water and scoop up different grains that they needed and things like that. We also see another very complex system with this, which is a sequoia. The one I can't say. It has the gears in the channel, the bucket, and the well. We see a well. Who hasn't had a well? Who hasn't seen a well in their lifetime? The bucket goes down, it collects water from underground, it brings it back up. You have this great fertile water. Beautiful for plants and amazing for growing things. It can also be used in people's houses as a way of getting fresh water into your home for cooking or cleaning or whatever you need. You also have this square pallet chain pump, which took me a minute to actually figure out. But you have these 2 men who are pumping this chain and are clearing this river so that you have a nice irrigational system that is nice and clear and the water can flow through simply. And then you also have the shaduf. It's a fun one. And you see this man dipping this net into the water to pull back up. We see similar systems like this today. Most common one I could think of is one used for fishing. And I'm not sure that this is what this was used for, but to me it looks like a net that you would sink into the water and then collect your fish or whatever you're trying to catch and then pull it back up, and there you go. You have some food. You have a food source that is created from this water. So from that we see different examples of technologies back then that are reflected in today's society. Sure, they may not have the exact same uses, but many of them are used in almost the exact same fashion. Your water wheel still churns out water, whether it be for whatever they used it for back then or for now, where it's mostly used for electronic like electrical production. And whether this, we have the Sakia used for getting water from down under. We use wells now for getting water from underground. Moving on, sorry. We have an aerial photograph of the pre-Roman city, which is our first source from this whole chapter, and to me, one of the cooler ones to look at. Because whenever you look at it, you have these amazing granular lines where you can see these darker lines are where the old irrigation systems used to be. And you can see how they kind of cross, especially right here in the center. You see this nice deep dark line, and you see other lines crossing the other way. These white lines over top are more of what we have today in place, and these are the newer irrigational systems, which look like much cleaner lines. You can tell that they're newer just because they have that nice straight edge to them. But the thing is, if you look at them really closely, they're almost perfectly overlapping each other where they need to be, which shows that the irrigation systems that they had back then are something that we are still using in order to make sure that the irrigational flows of today are flowing at the highest and most efficient rate possible, because we still find that water is something we need, and water is something that is of value and importance. Sure, today we can go buy a bottle of water from any 7-Eleven or Sunoco or any gas station right around the corner, or we can even get it right out of our sinks, for heaven's sakes. But back then, you had to work for it a little bit more. Moving on, you have our Landsat imagery of the water systems. And something really cool to notice is that anywhere where you have a large mass of them, they always seem to hit in a specific spot. You have these little points of conjunction, which we can assume are where major amounts of people lived, because that's what makes the most sense. Whether it's a farmland or it's the center of a city, you're going to want the most water concentrated where you need it the most. So, in using our Landsat imagery, we can see that in the center points of these, we can assume that there are great masses of people living there and that those are the most developed areas. This can hold true to today because a lot of these Landsat images, these are going to be the same systems that we're going to be using in order to see where our archaic and more premium levels of where we need to put things are. We can use this Landsat imagery today to see where the pre-existing irrigation is and to just build on top of it rather than trying to make a whole new system. This is beneficial because water, as we've already discussed, is a lot more readily available today due to what they've already preemptively done for us in our past. Our ancestors doing their irrigation in the very amazing technologically advanced way that they did benefits us because we're able to get water so much more readily and so much easier. Now, this isn't to say that water was something that they had an easy time getting. They had a very difficult time getting it at first, I'm sure. And this is seen because they had to make these advancements in order to get the water and the supply that they needed. If water was so easily available, they wouldn't have had to make these advancements. They wouldn't have had to have these irrigational systems. They wouldn't have had to make the technology that we've already discussed. So the reason that they made these technologies and they had these irrigational systems, they had all of these different parameters in place, is because water was their life source. Water still is a life source for us today. If you don't have water in your system, you're dead. So, sorry. Moving on to our last argument here, and probably the most prominent. I just want to make sure I have my papers in order here. Whenever we're looking at things that are important in our history, a lot of times we want to look at the laws in place as well as the emphasis put on different irrigational systems, or systems in general. Irrigational just because of what we're talking about right now. Now, I know in my outline I started with source 10, but I'd actually like to start with source 8 just because I feel like it really drives this point. Because even with the difficulties that the text shows, our societies never gave up on their projects, and that is something that I think is really easily evidenced by source 10 and even by source 11, but I think something that's a little bit harder to find is that they form legal parameters around the water systems because the water systems held that level of importance to them. So in source 8, we see this, it's the sections of Code of Hammurabi referring to the irrigational system. This is from 1750 BCE. So it's the before era, so it's rather old text that we're looking at. And in this old text, they're still saying if a man neglects his dike or his like water system there, and the bike, it happens to break, he has to repay for the grain that is destroyed on his end, on other people's property. Anything that's been damaged, he has to pay for. If he is not able to replace this grain that he has destroyed, they sell him. That's what it says, quote, word for word. If he is not able to replace the grain, comma, they sell him and his goods. The farmers of the area whose grain and water had been carried, like whose grain the water had carried away, they get to reap the benefits because they get to take whatever profits are made from selling him and his goods, and they just split them up. That way they can replace the grain, they can fix their farms, and everything moves on smoothly. But that just shows that there is a price to pay, a very hefty price that you have to pay if you are to mess up in doing these water systems. You also have just saying the same thing over again. If a man opens his canal and neglects it, he has to pay out for it. If it destroys improvements made on an adjacent field, he has to pay 10 gur per grain of burr. So he has to pay 10 grain-ish for the amount dependent upon the damage done to the land. And then finally you have if a man steals a watering machine, he has to pay 5 shekels of silver to his owner of the watering machine. Now, I'm not an expert in ancient society money, but 5 shekels, I've heard of the word shekels before, but then I saw the word silver and I immediately understood that that is a lot of money for their time. Because silver is still a very expensive material nowadays. Maybe not as expensive as it was whenever it first came around, but because of the fact that we keep using it and that it's becoming a smaller commodity, it's becoming more and more expensive. And so we understand that when we hear silver or gold or anything like that, that those are very precious materials. And so when somebody has to pay 5 coins of silver in order to replace this man's watering machine, or because he simply stole it, you understand that it's a hefty fine for messing with a water system. This again emphasizes the importance that water held in making sure that the society is able to hold their water and their farming systems to a higher standard and a higher profit. Moving on, we have the public works of Roman irrigation, which is our source number 10. And this is a very long-winded source to me that I thought was a little, I know it's like nice and short and sweet, it's only like a paragraph long, but I feel that all you really need to see from this is that they had so many different water projects going on, and that the water projects held such an emphasis with the emperor, the person who was in charge of these different 30,000 men he had at work. He had them at work without interruption. He had them at work on these water systems with no matter the cost. He provided the land. He made sure that these were going to happen. The fact that the emperor had 30,000 of his men that he could have used in any other sort of way. He could have been using them for the army, for protection, for building, for expansion. But instead he chose to use them for water systems. And this is important because our water systems then must hold the same amount of significance and power as an army. You don't just have 30,000 men out there doing anything. Even nowadays, 30,000 men is a huge labor force. You don't see 30,000 men building a hotel. You see a crew of maybe 100 men. Your crews for building things are not that huge nowadays. And that's not to say that it's because of our technological advancements. That's to say that you don't have that number of people building something unless it's something that you really need done. the fact that he devoted this amount of labor force, that he had this number of people, that they were in uninterrupted force, that shows that the difficulties brought by these projects, he decided to meet by making sure that he overstaffed it to make sure that this project got done no matter the cost, no matter the consequence. Finally, and sorry that this has been such a long-winded thing, we go on to our source 11. Our source number 11 here tells us that we're looking at Hinshin's regulations, or the interests that he had in the water systems. It says activities of Shou Jinshan Han Dynasty, and this is before 33 BCE. That is a very vague time just to say before, because obviously you have a few years there then. So he was promoted to be the Grand General Administrator of Nyangnyang. Please don't make fun of me for that. He was a person of energy plans, took an interest in creating anything that benefited the people. He traveled about and inspected water springs and commanded that people had to dig canals and ditches, build water gates and dikes in several places. He went through as much as 500,000 acres. He wanted people to obtain benefits no matter where they were. He saw water as such an importance that he went through and he investigated and he made sure that all these different areas that held water sources were being used to their fullest potential so that people could reap the benefits, and so that as future generations went on, water wouldn't ever be a problem. Because, and I'm probably sounding like a broken record at this point, water was such an important part of their society. Being an important part of their society, that's why we see in all of these arguments and all of these evidences that we have political leaders focusing on water. We have anybody who has a milligram of power being connected to water. In conclusion, what we see in here is political leaders of all sorts, emperors, princes. You have people who we wouldn't normally consider to be political in any form, such as an aquatic engineer or a flood specialist, having strong political ties and strong political powers. You see them having this hefty influence upon society and the way it's formed. You see them having this heavy influence on the economics and on the politics of the society, because the economics are propelled by the water. Because the water promotes trade, the water promotes vitality and fertility of the soil, and any time that you have one of these water sources, you have a society being formed around it or taking it so that it can benefit their society. Finally, I just want to say that water is something that we all need to survive. Water is something that they had back then, that they all felt was necessary to make sure that their societies thrived. Back then, getting a glass of water was not that simple, but because of all the hard work that they did, we are now able to reap the benefits, and that's a cheers to that.